Right, good morning everyone. Now that Rob's warmed up for everyone, we're going to take a look today at Azure AD Domain Services. So Microsoft appear to have given up on the 3-letter acronyms and now we're on to 5-letter acronyms. So that's always good fun. I will not be calling it that throughout the session because it is a mouthful. So if I refer to that as AAD DS or Domain Services, what I'm referring to is Azure AD Domain Services, but we'll be here all day if I use that name. So, AAD DS, domain controllers in the cloud, with a question mark. And you'll understand why as we go into this, because we're going to have a look at this solution and actually figure out why it's useful, or whether it's useful for your use cases. So, it's my massive face. My name is Sam Cogan. I'm a solutions architect for a company called Willis Towers Watson, most people have never heard of. And I'm also an Azure MVP. Some links down there for my blog and Twitter and GitHub repository. So all of these slides and any code samples and so on are going to be on GitHub once I've finished. So if you do want to grab any of those, feel free. And say most of my stuff I put on my blog there. So if you're interested, do take a look. Now, as I said, I work for a company called Willis Towers Watson. And Willis Towers Watson is a financial services company. And the bit I work in is around actuarial modeling, which is modeling risk, catastrophes, those sort of things. I don't know anything about that, I just work in the IT bit, but that's what they do. And I have the pleasure, because of that, having to work with an awful lot of legacy applications. And we're talking things that are possibly 10, 15 years old. We have a lot of new shiny stuff as well, but there are a lot of legacy things that actuaries like to use. And because of that, we have the privilege of having to deal with the fact that most of these applications expect to be able to talk to some sort of Active Directory domain. And this then proves to be a pretty big challenge when you start looking at trying to migrate these services into the cloud. So I've had the pleasure of working with Azure AD and AD DS, or AAD DS, over the last couple of years. So what we're going to talk about today is just some of my experiences with how that works, the benefits of doing it and the issues with it, and see whether it's appropriate for your use cases. But before we dive into that, we need to take a little bit of a step back. So in the beginning, there was Azure Active Directory. When Azure was first launched, it was one of the first services available, and I imagine at the time all of the marketing people at Microsoft were feeling really happy with themselves. Everybody knows what Active Directory is, so everyone will know what Azure Active Directory is. No problem, it's a great name, let's call it that. And everyone did know what Active Directory was, so everyone assumed they knew what Azure Active Directory was. And you end up with lots of questions like these. Now, hands up, when you first encountered AD or AAD, did you ask questions like this? Because I know I certainly did. The first one, the top left there. How do I join machines to this domain? I certainly asked that question, and lots of people I've spoken to also asked the question. Well, it's Active Directory, so I can just join machines, right? It's nope. Well, I can do LDAP queries, can't I? No, you can't do that. Okay. What about group policies? Where do I do them? Nope, no group policy. All right. DNS? No. No. None of those things work because Azure Active Directory isn't really Active Directory. It has a similar name, I suspect, again, because of marketing, but what you actually got was a user and group store, effectively, for modern authentication. It's designed for your web applications, your cloud-hosted applications that can talk directly to it. Nobody thought you would want to join machines to your Azure AD game, or nobody at Microsoft thought that anyway. Everybody else did. And so you end up with this question every time anyone new comes along to look at AD, or Azure AD. And it's still happening today. I still see questions on the internet, on Server Fault and MSDN forums. I can't find the button to join my machine to AAD. So, in my view, it was a bad name choice and it's still causing problems today. But people still wanted to do these things. People still wanted to put applications in the cloud that needed Active Directory. Be they legacy applications or be they applications that just needed the functionality that was available in Active Directory. So a couple of years ago, Microsoft came along with a solution. Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Everybody's happy. And Azure AD Domain Services, not Directory Services, sorry, Domain Services, is really two things. It gives you the ability to run an Active Directory domain in the cloud as a service, and it gives you the ability to push your Azure AD users and groups down into an Active Directory domain. Those are the two features that this service offers you when you run this in Azure. But in my view, it might have been a little bit of a monster. Whenever you have a conversation now with anyone from Microsoft or a lot of consultants, and you say, well, I want to go to the cloud, but I need AD. Their first response is, sorry, AAD DS. Just use that, it's fine. It'll solve all your problems. And it doesn't. AAD DS has a number of, let's call them limitations in what it can do and what it allows you to do. And a lot of this comes from what it was designed to do. In my view, it was never designed to be a catch-all domain services in the cloud. It was designed for specific use cases, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And for those use cases, it is a great solution. So if what you're looking to do fits in the use cases we'll talk about, then this absolutely is the solution for you. But if you're trying to do something outside of those use cases, then it might not be because of what we're going to talk about. So we need to be a bit careful when we think about this, that it is not just the default answer to, I need a domain in the cloud. And I imagine lots of people today are still putting actual VMs with domain controllers in the cloud, and for some people, that's still going to be the way to do it at the moment. So think about this. Think about nice friends at Jurassic Park. Should we actually be doing this? Or is it just building another monster that we're going to have to deal with later? So it'll all make sense in a little bit, but bear that in mind. Okay. So, as I said, AAD DS is a solution for putting domain controllers in Azure that you don't have to manage. It's a service solution that you can connect to with your cloud services, and Microsoft will manage that for you. And you can put it in two different scenarios, either a cloud-only scenario or a hybrid scenario where you're working with on-premise as well. So this is the first scenario, and I've stolen these diagrams from Microsoft site, so you can find them on the AADS page. But this is a cloud-only scenario. So this is where you have no on-premise presence. You don't have any existing Active Directory, and you've got an Azure Active Directory instance that you've created, and you've populated that with users, groups, service principals, applications, all those sort of things. And you want to extend that by having a domain services instance in your virtual network. So we'll go through the configuration process in a minute, but what you're going to do is turn on or enable AAD DS and point it at a virtual network in Azure, and that will create your AAD DS instance in that virtual network. So it has to be joined to a virtual network, and once you've done that and you've configured it appropriately, you then effectively have proper domain controllers running in that VNet that you can then use to join machines to the domain. You can configure DNS for the internals of the virtual network. You can run LDAP queries against that domain controller. You can do a lot of the things that you do with classic domain controllers. That's the cloud-only approach, and that's probably the simplest approach. The second approach is a hybrid approach, where we do everything we talked about before, but you've got this on-premise component already. So you've already got domain controllers, and this is probably a scenario most people are in. You've already got domain controllers that are dealing with your on-premise workloads, and you want to involve that in this situation. So most people who are using on-premise AD and have Azure and Azure AD are probably using Azure AD Connect. So that's the tool that allows you to synchronize your users and groups from your on-premise domain controllers up into Azure AD and use them for cloud authentication. So in this scenario, you can continue doing that. You're just adding, again, domain services as an extension to that. and it then works with the users that you've synced up from the on-premise environment into Azure Active Directory and then across into your domain services instance. There are some complications around this we're going to come into in a minute, so don't think this is the perfect solution for your use cases until you've seen those complications. But that is the hybrid approach. What we're going to do is have a quick look at how you actually set that up. So, turn that off because I need a thing. So, one thing you have to be aware of, first off, is that when you create an Azure AD instance, you have to, or AAD DS instance, you have to put it into a virtual network and you have to put it into a subscription. That Azure subscription must sit under that tenant in Active Directory. You cannot enable it in a tenant that's not the one you want the domain controller in. That didn't used to be the case when this was a classic resource. You could set it up in a different tenant. So if you're running, I know a lot of people are, you have a management tenant where all of your management users exist and you put all of your resources and you want to put this under a different tenant, you will have to move the subscription. That is a limitation of how the service works. So I'm going to go ahead and creating this if the internet decides to work. Okay. We'll click on create. Okay, so what it's going to ask you for is firstly, the actual Azure Active Directory you want to connect this to, and so you don't have an option there. You just pick the one that my subscription is hosted under. Then you want to pick the actual domain name that you're going to use for actually on the domain controller, the subscription obviously, and then you need to put it in a resource group. So we'll create. I think I've already got one there. Yep. And the location, which it picks the default from your resource group, but you can put it in a different location. And we're going to talk a bit more in the future about the location piece, but just at this point you need to pick one. Then you need to put it in a virtual network. Wi-Fi I'm on. Why is this? Okay. I don't have it at the moment, so I'm just going to create a new virtual network. Give that address space. Now, I'm also going to create a subnet there. This is another service where you need to put AAD DS in its own subnet. So you need to allocate a subnet for that, along with all the other things we talked about yesterday for SQL managed instances, app gateway, all those sort of things. So it needs its own subnet. So we'll create that. Okay, so the first sort of AAD specific thing we need to do is configure the administrator group. So users who you want to be an administrator of your domain, so they will, it's not the domain admin role, and we'll talk about that, but they who have administrator rights on the domain need to be added to this group. So it's going to create a group for you called AAD DC administrators. You don't get your choice in that, that's the name that has to be used. And you're going to want to put users in there that you want to be able to manage the domain. And you can actually do it at this point when you do the wizard, or you can come back to it later and you can add users into that group at any time. That's fine. And because it's being slow, we'll leave that as is for now. And then you click OK, and that will go and start the deployment. Now this deployment takes a while, and by a while I mean about an hour. So you do need to leave it run. And so we're going to sit here and watch this now, and we'll come back in an hour. No. I've already done one, so we'll hop back over to my other tenant, and once your deployment's finished, you'll be presented with this resource here. So, see that? There's not a lot that you can actually do in the portal. It's a fairly simple interface, as you can see there. There are a couple of things you need to do once the deployment has finished. So the first one, and I've already done it here, but if I hadn't, there would be a button here which would say set up DNS. So, as with any AD network, your network needs to use your domain controllers as the primary DNS servers. So you can come in here and click a button that says, set this up for me, and that will go and configure your virtual network for you. Or you can do it manually. So I've got a network here, and you can configure the DNS to point to the domain controllers. So when this loads, there's 2 domain controllers. You can configure that manually. Now, those are the IP addresses of my domain controllers, and you can actually see that through the window here if you look in, where is it on here, properties? Yeah. So it'll give you the 2 IP addresses of the domain controllers that it's spun up. So that's what it's doing behind the scenes, is it creates two domain controllers, and each one of them is given the appropriate IP address. And you can actually see, so if you look in the resource group, you can't see the actual VMs that are spun up behind the scenes, but what you can see are the network cards and the load balancer that sits in front of them that are actually joined to your virtual network. So you can see them, you can go and look at them. You can probably delete them, but don't, because it will stop working. And then it configures all that for you. One other thing as well is that you can configure a network security group on the VNet that you deploy to protect that environment. But there are certain rules that are required for it to work. So if you can see, zoom in a little bit, you can see here there are these 4 rules here that have been created on there. If you create the VNet using the wizard, and you configure the NSG in the wizard, it will do this for you. So you don't have to remember them, but they are documented on the Microsoft site as well. But you need these rules. And there's 4 of them. So the first one there on port 443 is allowing the sync of your AAD domain into your AAD DS domain. The rest of them here are for management, not for you to manage them, but for Microsoft to manage them. And so that's basically allowing remote desktop and allowing PowerShell remoting into the environment. Those IP addresses are the ones they've configured, so I assume they're their management resources. But you need to configure them if you're going to use a network security group. And I recommend you do use a network security group. Okay. That's about it in terms of actually deploying the solution. So this is now running in my virtual network, and I can now go into that, and I've got a machine on that virtual network here, and this machine has been joined to that domain. So you can see there, this has been joined to the samcogan.com domain. You just do that in the same way as you do with any AD domain join. You just need to make sure that when you do it, you are using a user that you added to that admins group. So from now on, all of my management work of this domain is done in the same way as I would do with a normal AD domain. So I've installed the remote server administration tools on here, and so I can go into Active Directory users and computers, eventually. And I can see my domain there, and I can manage that just like I would a normal domain, with the limitations we're going to talk about in a minute. But that's pretty much the limit of your interaction with Azure Part. At this point now, we'll move on and we'll use it like any other domain. Pop back over there. So let's get into the interesting pieces. What are the benefits of doing this, and what are the restrictions that are going to impact whether you can use it or not? So we'll start with the benefits because they're easy. As I mentioned, this is a PaaS service, so Microsoft are managing this for you. That means that the deployment is a couple of clicks, and the actual management of the resources, the patching, the configuration, the AV scanning, all that sort of stuff is handled for me by Microsoft. I don't need to manage that. I don't need to worry about updating those machines. They're going to take care of that for me. They're also going to take care of the high availability. So I showed you there's 2 domain controllers down there. If one of those domain controllers dies behind the scenes, you'll use a second one, and Microsoft will take care of bringing back another domain controller, doing all the AD replication for you and all that sort of thing. So you don't have to worry about that because it's a PaaS service. It's also the only way you can achieve a sync from Azure AD to AD. If you're using on-prem, you cannot sync that direction. You used to be able to for a little while. They disabled it. I'm not clear on the reasons why, But if you want to sync that way, so have Azure AD as your source of truth, this is the only way to achieve that. As Rick mentioned yesterday, this will follow the just-in-time admin approach that you can do with privileged identity management in Azure. So those users that we talked about, who you're putting in the admin group, you can require them to elevate to their appropriate Azure AD role. If you want to make changes in Azure AD, they're going to sync back down to your on-premise resources. Sports group policy, so you can have it, you can configure policies that are then applied to the machines that you attach to that domain. And it supports all the standard Azure AD or AD protocols, so LDAP, NTLM, Kerberos. There are some limitations around those, but they do work. And you don't require any sort of connectivity between the AAD environment and your VNet other than the standard Azure stuff. You don't need to configure a VPN. You don't need to configure ExpressRoute to do that synchronization. Obviously, if you are doing the sync from your on-prem, you might do that. You don't need to with AD Connect, but you might to make that more secure. But for AAD DS, you don't need to do any of that. So what it gives you is a fully managed domain running in your VNet that you don't really have to care about the management of. You are just going to care about using it, configuring it, those sort of things. So what's wrong with it? Well, first off, there were a number of issues when it first launched. A lot of these have gone away now. So if you're reading old articles or people are telling you can't do this because of this, these issues are no longer present. So for a long time, this was a classic resource. Even when classic resources were dying off and everyone was moving to ARM, it was one of the last holdovers of the classic world. This is no longer the case. So it's now in the ARM portal. You can deploy it as we saw there. You join it to an ARM virtual network. In the old days, you used to have to join it to a classic VNet and peer it across to your ARM network, which was painful. You don't need to do that anymore. You can also configure custom GPOs and custom OUs now. When it was first released, you couldn't do that. You had the OUs it came with, and you had one policy for users and one policy for machines, and that was it. You can now create custom GPOs and custom OUs. It does now support Kerberos, as I mentioned on the previous slide. Again, that wasn't possible originally, but you can now do it. And it is now available in CSP, so cloud solution providers, if you're reselling Azure. That was mainly because of the classic restrictions. So now it's moved out of classic and into ARM. You can now use it as a CSP. So those have all gone away. These issues have not. And I'm not entirely sure if it's fair to call them issues, because a lot of them are just the limitations of the service in the way it's designed and what it's designed to do. But these 7 are sort of the top issues that I think are going to impact most people who want to use this service. So we'll take a look through at each of these and see why they're a problem. So number 1, and to be honest, I think this is the biggest issue that's going to prevent anyone using this, even if it does fit your use case, is multi-region support. As you saw when we deployed it, we picked a region to put the domain controllers in. And once we pick that region, that's where they go, and we cannot change that without destroying the domain controllers and rebuilding them. There is no option to put them in a second region and have disaster recovery across to another region. You cannot replicate them to another region. You are stuck with putting them in one region. That, for most people I speak to, is not acceptable as a production service. If that region goes down, you've lost your domain. So all of the DR you might put into all your other services, if you're relying on that domain, it's going to, none of it's going to work. Now, Microsoft are aware of this. I spoke to them at Ignite about this, and it is on the roadmap. It's probably the number 1 item on the roadmap, but I think there's still a fair amount of work to go on. And in my view, it should have been in much earlier. This is difficult to call a production service without being able to put them in multiple regions. So be aware of that. Be aware that you can only put them in one region and you can only have one instance of AAD DS. So if you've got other business units that want to make use of AAD DS, they have to share your instance. So most people who are using it, I've seen, are putting this in sort of a core VNet that other areas are going to then peer to and talk to, because you can only have one. Domain admin rights, you don't get any. So when you put people in that admin group I talked about, they get a limited set of administrator rights that allow them to do specific things in the domain. Things like managing users, managing GPOs, managing OUs, managing DNS. Those things you can do, but you are not a domain admin, you are not an enterprise admin. You cannot change the schema. You cannot fiddle with sites and services. You don't get any rights beyond the specific ones they give to you. So you are not going to be able to do certain things. You cannot, for example, hook up Exchange in this environment. Not that I'd advise you doing it, but you cannot edit the schema, so you cannot put Exchange in there. SharePoint, similarly, has some issues around it. If you want to deploy SharePoint in that environment, you don't have the rights to do that. I'm not saying you should, but it's just an example of what you... But I'm sure there are plenty of other examples as to why you would need some additional rights. So you don't get them. You get to do the specific roles that you are given and nothing more. User creation, and I'm going to hop back over to the environment to give you a demo of this because it's easier to see. So this is my AAD users and computers, and you can see here there's a OU here called AAD DS users. This is created for me when I deploy the domain, and this is where all of my users that are created in Azure AD are located. And I cannot move those users. So this is the limitation. Those users, because they're created in Azure AD, are here, and that's where they must stay. And I also can't do much with them. So if I come in here and try and reset the password, it's not going to match. It's going to give me an error, because I don't have the ability to do that. The assumption is that changes like this where you are managing Azure AD users, you will do in Azure AD, not in here. Now I can still do things like apply group policies to these users, and I can have a look at them, I can unlock the account and that sort of thing, but things like changing the users and editing their details, this is all read-only, see? Now, I can go and create users outside of that OU. So I can come in here and I can create a new user. Meeting the password policy, so let's try that again. Going well. There you go. So that works, but that user is not going to then appear in Azure AD. These users are in the AAD DS domain only. You can use them in your AAD DS resources and machines that are joined to there, but they're not going to replicate up to Azure AD. So if you want users that exist in both environments, you need to create them using Azure AD and sync them down, and they will be in that OU only. One of the main reasons for creating users outside of that is if you need service accounts in the domain itself. That's the most common reason why you would do that. But you are limited to using those users if you're going to want to use the ones from AAD. Hybrid sync. So this is the synchronization from your on-premise domain up to AAD and then across to Azure AD DS. The thing to bear in mind in here, your AAD DS domain is not a replica of your on-premise domain. It is a new domain, a completely separate domain that just happens to have the same name as your on-premise one, and your users and groups are synchronized across the two. Nothing else is synchronized. You do not synchronize group policies, you do not synchronize your OU structure, you do not synchronize your password policies, anything like that. It's groups, users, and that is pretty much it. So Bear that in mind if you are looking to do things like synchronize group policies. If you want to do that, you're going to have to recreate the group policies in your AAD DS domain using exports of the ones from your on-premise domain. It is not the same domain. Custom OUs links back to the user conversation. So if we hop back to the machine again, you see here, I can create custom OUs quite easily, and I can move computers around if I want to. So let's take this computer and we'll move that into my test OU. That works fine, but again, I can't move my users that are in this OU into a different custom OU. And that means that we're going to talk about in a second with the GPOs, but if I want to apply things like group policies, they have to be, and I want to scope them appropriately for my users, then I need to scope them at this OU. I can't scope them to a different OU, and therefore I need to then start doing filtering on things like groups or machine types or OSs, that sort of thing. I have to be a bit more complicated about my filtering. And these OUs, these custom OUs that I've created down here, are really only useful for my computers or my service accounts. I can't differentiate my users in that manner. You can't even create a sort of sub-OU underneath that OU. They've all got to be in the top level. We kind of already talked about this. Again, custom GPOs have the same limitation. You've got to apply them to an OU, obviously. You've got that OU for the users. You can apply more than one GPO to that OU. So there's a default one, it comes with the default users GPO. You can edit that and you can add things to that, or you can create a new GPO and add that to that OU. So you can have multiples, but what you can't do is put users in different GPO and scope a different OU and scope them to that appropriately. Machines are fine, aside from the domain controllers, which need to be in the domain controller OU. Everything else you can put in a separate OU and you can scope GPOs appropriately to that. Kerberos delegation. So I mentioned you could do this, and you can, but it only supports the newer resource-based Kerberos delegation. So the old-fashioned Kerberos delegation using set SPN commands, those sort of service principals, does not work because, again, it needs more rights than you have on the domain. So if you want to use Kerberos delegation, you need to use the newer resource-based Kerberos delegation. Sure, that's necessarily a problem because it is actually nicer to use and easier to use. But if you've got, scripts and deployment tools that will set that up for you and you're using the older Kerberos delegation, it will not work. You will need to change to using resource-based delegation. So those were the sort of top issues that I think are going to be the ones that actually decide whether the service is right for you or not. There are a few others I just wanted to call out that are not necessarily blockers, but something to be aware of. So if you're using multi-domain forests, you can still configure AAD DS because you can still configure that with Azure AD Sync. But what you will get synchronized across is just a flat structure of your forest. It will just be users and groups. That's it. There'll be no hierarchies from your forest. You will just get a flat structure. And obviously on the AAD DS side, there is no support for additional domains and forests. You get one domain. LDAP queries, you can certainly do LDAP queries, but they are going to be read-only. You cannot write to the LDAP interface of AAD DS. This one is pretty annoying. Password lifetime and lockout doesn't sync between AAD and AAD DS. So you can set your policies on AAD DS to set lockout, password expiry duration, all those sort of things you could do normally, but they only apply to your AADS side of things. They don't synchronize across to AAD. So you could have a user whose account is perfectly fine in AAD, they can log on to any web apps that use that or anything like that. But when they try to log on to the AAD DS environment, their password is expired or locked out. And in my view, if somebody's locked their account out in the ADDS environment, they should probably be locked out everywhere. But that's not how it works. There's no support for B2C or B2B users. So the discussion we had yesterday about adding guest users using B2B, they don't get synchronized across to your AAD DS domain. You can't use them. You can only use users who are homed in your AAD tenant. And there is a limited amount of regions. Now, it's not that limited, so most of the main regions have it. So East and West Europe, Southeast and East Asia, most of the US regions do have this enabled. But there are some of the smaller regions, like UK, France, India, a few of the others that don't have this service enabled at the moment. So you'll need to pick where you want to do this. Obviously, if you want to do this and you've got resources in another region, you can still deploy it to the available region and use global VNet peering to connect your VNets together and transfer data in that manner, but you won't be able to deploy that in those regions. And the last point there, it is fairly expensive if you've got a small workload. So AAD DS is priced based on the number of objects you put in your domain. And the minimum size is 25,000 objects. So if you have less than that, you'll still get charged for 25,000. And that comes out at about £90 a month, which is about 90 euros, thanks Brexit. You know, it's not huge, but it's a fairly expensive if you're just putting a few users in there. So bear that in mind. So, given all of what we've talked about today, when would you use this? What are the good use cases and what are the bad use cases? What it was really designed for is lift and shift. Microsoft want you to get your applications and put them in Azure, and if that means you need LDAP, then that's what AAD DS was built for. If you've got applications that need to talk to a domain controller, then you can use AAD DS to provide that domain controller interface. And it's just there for your applications to use. That is a perfect use case for AAD DS. You're not using it for anything else. You're not trying to manage hordes of users and really complex group policies or anything like that. You need an application. It needs to run on a server that can talk LDAP or that can talk Kerberos. That's a great use case for this scenario. I mean, the ideal use case is to take your application and redesign it, but I think we all know that's not feasible in a lot of environments, or at least not feasible in the short term. The next one is a little bit more tenuous, but if you need to extend your on-premise presence of users into Azure, this can be a good way to do it. And I'm more thinking about where you've got Azure resources, you've got VMs in Azure that you need admins to go in and manage, and you want to use a central user store like AD to be able to log on to those machines and to control people's passwords and all that sort of stuff, then AAD DS can be used to do that quite easily rather than building your own domain controllers in the cloud. But I am really just talking about the situation where you need to do that for administrators and a limited set of users rather than putting your whole network domain into Azure. There are some specific use cases where you have to use AAD DS. So one of those is what we talked about yesterday was the Azure Files access control list. So if you want to use Azure Files to store your data and you want to restrict access to that data, then using something other than the storage key, then you need to use AAD DS. And if we have time, I can do a quick demonstration of that, how that works. So you will need AADS deployed to do that. Isolated test environments are a pretty good scenario, particularly if you need to test against AD, but also if you just want to be in the scenario we talked about a minute ago, where you just want to control access and make sure you're using consistent user accounts. You can deploy AADS very quickly. You can even deploy it, run your tests and tear it down if you want to. I mean, it still takes an hour to deploy, so it's not that quick, but you can do that. And if you want to test things against AAD, it can be a pretty, it can be a pretty quick way to do so. RDS environments are quite a good use case if that's all you want to do. So if you're deploying remote desktop to deploy application, it's something I've had to do quite a bit with some of the fat applications we need to deliver. If you just want to put that in Azure and you just want to run an RDS farm, you do need AD for that. So things like remote desktop gateway require you to have AD. But if all you're using that for is to service remote desktop, then it's a pretty good scenario to put that in there. And the remote desktop team do support and even document the use of AAD DS for that type of scenario. And we kind of covered that already, but if you just want something to simply administer a few users that you just want to make sure they're using the same account, the same password across machines and managing password policies and so on, then it's a pretty good use case. What you shouldn't use it for. So the first thing is that the multi-region availability is going to restrict a lot of people from using that. So if you need it in multiple regions for your DR or for your compliance perspective, then it's not going to support what you need to do now. Probably need to just walk away and come back later when it does support that. It's unfortunate, but that's the way it stands today. This is the big one. AAD DS is not a replacement for your on-premise domain. The amount of people I've spoken to who have said, brilliant, AAD DS is here, let's throw away all our domain controllers. We don't need them anymore. That is not what it was for. It was never intended to be that. It is not designed to do that. If you're relying on the fact that all of your on-prem computers can talk to a domain controller in the cloud and your internet connection goes down, you've lost all of your authentication. You also can't run your Exchange server if you've got one on-prem against it, or SharePoint or whatever, but it is not for replacing your AD domain. If you want to join your desktop computers to a domain in the cloud, use Win10 domain join for AAD. This is not what this is for. And the amount of conversations I've had about that is somewhat staggering. It is not for anything that needs the schema changing. So anything like we talked about Exchange, or anything that just needs domain admin rights is not going to work. So be aware of what your application or what you're trying to do in the cloud needs, and if it needs those rights, this isn't going to work for you. You're probably going to have to deploy IaaS domain controllers and do it that way. If you cannot support password hash sync, then this is not for you. So I know a lot of, particularly working in financial services, a number of clients will not allow their password hashes to be synchronized outside of on-premise. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing in certain situations. But obviously this solution relies on those password hashes being on your cloud domain controllers. So if you can't synchronize those, then this is not going to work for you. And it is not a solution for disaster recovery of your on-premise domains. Again, when you do your synchronization from on-prem, it's not the same domain. It's a copy of the users from that and groups from that domain. So it is not a DR scenario for your on-premise domain. Okay. How are we doing for time? 15 minutes. So let's take a quick look at the use case for Azure Files. So if you recall what we said yesterday, you can, if you can find the storage account that I created, there we go, yeah. You can configure a file share using Azure Files. And you can map that to your machine if you want to, and I think I've got it mapped here already. I did yesterday. Yeah, so this share here is mapped, and it's mapped using a command. With me. Okay, so this is the command you would use for mapping a file share in the default manner. So I specify netuse, the files ACL account, storage URL there, and the share name, and then I'm passing there my storage key. If you want to write that down, you can steal my storage account as the password to that account. That's how it's works up till now. So if I want to pass that share out to users, I need to provide them with a logon script or something similar that has those credentials in it. Obviously, we all know those aren't protected. The user, if they know what they're doing, could go and find that logon script and get that password, take it home, connect to the file share from home, take it when they leave the company and connect to it later. I mean, you should be rolling that key, but I know everyone doesn't. So that's an issue. So what we can do instead now is configure ACLs on those file shares using Active Directory users, which are synchronized to AAD DS. That means when I come to do my my mapping, I'm just going to use this netuse command here which is just netuse the file share. And it's going to take my credentials that I'm logged into the machine with and use those to authenticate me to the machine. Setting this up is a little bit more complicated than you might expect. Maybe you do expect if it's working with Microsoft. But so there are two things you need to do. So as with on-premise shares, there are two sets of permissions. There are the NTFS permissions, which are pretty much the same as in this environment. And then there are the share permissions. In this world, the share permissions are configured as a role in Active Directory, not as something you configure directly on the share in Windows. So you need to create a custom role. So if you're not familiar with custom roles in Azure, they are effectively JSON files that define what a user can do using Azure permissions. And so this role here is a simple role for doing Azure file shares to give you read, write, and delete access. This is taken directly from the Microsoft site, so if you do want to do this, just have a look at the documentation for AAD, for ACLs. But what all I'm doing here basically is granting the user pretty much everything in the actions column and everything in the data actions. So data actions is really relevant to things like storage, where you want to act on the data in the storage account. Now, you might be slightly concerned by the fact I'm granting everything there. This is less of a concern because we're actually going to scope this just to the file share, nothing else. So they're not going to get any extra rights. What I am denying them access to do is to actually go in and delete or edit the permissions on that file share themselves. So they won't be able to do that. So what I have to do to actually get this to work is apply this custom role. So you can do that using PowerShell or CLI to configure a set Azure RM role definition, I think is the command. And you pass it this JSON file and it creates a role. And then what you would then do is go back into your storage account and not look at blobs because we're doing file shares. So go into files. And I've already got a share in here. And that, I'm going to access control. And you can see, let's turn this off again. You can see here, so this is the name of my custom role. So if we look at that JSON, that's what I called the name. You can call it what you like, it doesn't really matter. But I've assigned that role to this all users group, which just happens to have all my, just a custom group I created that has all my users in it. You can configure that how you want, but you can assign that to users or groups. They now have access to the share permissions of that file. I still need to configure their NTFS permissions. That I can't do for the Azure piece. That is something you have to do in Windows. And what it means you basically have to do is the first time you set this up, you need to map the drive using the storage key, the old-fashioned way, which is what I've done here. And then you can set permissions on it, and then you can pass it out to users to use normally. The slight catch there is if I try and do this the way you would normally do through the GUI, it gives you this error because it can't determine whether it's on a domain or not for some reason. I don't know what the limitation here is, but what you need to do is actually apply those rights through the command line using the iCackles command. So if we hop back over here, we would use this command to grant users whatever rights you wanted to on the NTFS side of things. Once they've done that, you can then go and use that netuse command and zoom back out again and map the drive. And so what I've got here is this drive mapped and it's not reconnected it. So let's run that again. Let's just use a different drive slightly. Speed. So now that's mapped using my permissions directly on that share from AAD DS. So that's just an example of one of the use cases that AAD DS actually lets us do. Mm-hmm. Yes, I believe it should, because as long as you've got connectivity from the VNet your machine is in that you're trying to talk to Azure Files, it should work, I believe. I haven't tested that, but the theory is it should. Okay, so we're just going to summarize. There's a lot of this article that is talking about problems and issues with AAD DS, because unfortunately there are a fair amount of them. But I don't want you to walk away from here thinking, oh, it's terrible, don't use it. If you've got a use case that works for AAD DS, it is a good solution, because it means you don't have to manage IaaS, and nobody wants to manage IaaS, or at least most people, most sane people. So if you've got a solution that fits what it can do, use it. But don't try and shoehorn in things that are not appropriate for what you're doing. And for God's sake, do not try and just get rid of your on-premise domain controllers. The multi-region support is still a problem. And I really hope Microsoft are going to sort that out in the next couple of months, because if they do, then it will be a much, much better solution that can be used for better scenarios and shared between more people in your organization. So that is really one of the big blockers. But yeah, if you've got a scenario that fits it, application migration and lift and shift is a really good one, then this can be a great solution. But if you've got really complex domain systems that you want to deploy, and there are still scenarios where you do need to deploy that sort of thing, where you do need domain admins on your domain controller, but you want it in the cloud, then you are still going to be limited at the moment to putting IaaS domain controllers in there and managing the domain yourself, rather than having Microsoft do it for you. So just think about what you want to do, think about those limitations, and decide whether or not it is right for you. And that is it, unless anyone's got any questions. No? Okay, thank you very much.